She divorced her poor husband and married his boss, and she did it in public, in front of everyone who knew his name, smiling like it cost her nothing. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that earlier that same morning, at 9:14 a.m., a Charlotte law firm had finalized the transfer of a $2.2 trillion estate into her husband's name. Not a settlement, not an insurance policy, a controlling interest, 51% majority shareholder position in the very company her new man put his name on. The building, the deals, the career, the confidence. All of it had been running, without anyone knowing, through a structure that now belonged to the quiet man she just threw away. She left him for his boss. She had no idea she was leaving him for his employee. And the only thing sitting between that woman and the truth, the only thing her husband carried into that ballroom on the worst night of his life, was a plain manila folder she had been mocking for years. So here is the question. When a man already holds everything and the people who humiliated him don't know it yet, how long does he wait before he opens the folder? If you already know this story is going to be something, go ahead and hit that like button right now. And if you are new here, subscribe so you never miss what we bring to this channel, and drop your city in the comments. Let us know where in the world you are watching from today. This community shows up from everywhere, and we love to see it. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started, to a Thursday evening in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a ballroom full of people who were about to watch a man get dismissed like he was nothing, and to a folder sitting under his arm that none of them thought to ask about. The ballroom at the Charlotte Convention Center was the kind of room that made people stand up straighter the moment they walked in. Chandeliers hung low over round tables dressed in white linen. The bar was open, the jazz trio was working through something smooth in the corner, and the women in attendance had arrived in the kind of dresses that took 3 weeks to select. This was Adrienne's world. She had built it carefully, tended it the way some people tend gardens, cutting away anything that didn't fit the image she had cultivated, watering only what made her look like exactly the woman she believed herself to be. Calvin Reese did not fit the image. He parked his truck on the 4th level of the parking deck, the same level he always chose because it was close to the elevator, and he was a practical man. He sat for a moment before getting out, not from nervousness, but from the particular stillness that had become his default setting over the last several years. He checked his tie in the rearview mirror. The suit was his good one, charcoal grey, pressed that morning. He picked up the manila folder from the passenger seat, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the elevator. The folder went everywhere with him. It was a plain thing, letter-sized, slightly worn at the corners, no label on the front. Adrienne had been making jokes about it for years. She called it his hall pass. She told people he carried it because he thought it made him look important. She had said more than once that it was the most ambitious thing about him. Calvin never explained what was inside it. He rode the elevator down to the lobby level, crossed the marble floor of the convention center, and pushed through the ballroom doors at 7:14 in the evening. He saw her immediately. Adrienne was standing near the bar on the far side of the room, and she was luminous in the way she always was when she was performing. The navy dress, the earrings that cost more than his truck's monthly note. Her hair was done in a way that took 2 hours and looked effortless, which was the whole point. She was laughing at something, her head tilted back just enough to show the line of her neck, and the group around her was responding the way groups always responded to Adrienne, leaning in, competing for her attention, glad to be in proximity. Calvin noticed, before he noticed anything else, that Brandon Whitmore's hand was resting at the small of her back. Brandon Whitmore was Calvin's supervisor at Whitmore Development Group. He was the kind of man who shook hands like he was doing you a favor and remembered your name only when he needed something from you. Tall, silver at the temples, a suit that fit the way suits fit men who bought them in person from someone who knew their measurements. His name was on the building, his face was on the company website, and his hand was on Calvin's wife's back in a room full of people Calvin worked with. Calvin kept walking. He was maybe 15 feet from the group when Adrienne saw him. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like a calculation completing itself. She straightened. She reached out and touched Brandon's arm. And then Gloria Caldwell materialized from the left side of the group, Adrienne's mother, 61 years old, and dressed for a function she had not been invited to, her smile already loaded with the particular pity she reserved for her son-in-law. Calvin. Gloria said it the way you say a word you're tired of pronouncing. You made it. He nodded at her. He looked at Adrienne. Adrienne looked back at him for one long moment, and then she did something he had not anticipated. She reached into the small clutch purse on the table beside her and produced a folded set of documents. She set them on the table in front of her. She did not lower her voice. I was going to do this at home, she said. But I think we both know there is no good version of this conversation. The jazz trio was still playing. Someone nearby had stopped talking. Calvin felt the particular quality of attention that a room gives a scene it did not expect. Those are divorce papers, Adrienne said. I had them drawn up 3 weeks ago. Brandon has already moved into the house. We're getting married. She paused. I need you to sign. Brandon did not step away. He stood exactly where he was, his expression the tolerant half-smile of a man watching a situation resolve itself. He looked at Calvin the way a man looks at a parking ticket. Mildly inconvenient, already forgotten. Gloria reached over and patted the documents, as if directing Calvin's attention to them. It's a blessing when people can end things civilly, she said. That's what I always say. No sense dragging out what's already finished. Calvin looked at the papers. He looked at Adrienne. He looked at Brandon. Then he picked up the documents, produced a pen from his inside pocket, and signed where the tabs indicated. He set the pen down. He folded his copy, slid it into the outside pocket of the manila folder, and tucked the folder back under his arm. Adrienne blinked. She had not expected that. She had expected something she could respond to. You carry that thing to a gala, she said, and now there was an edge in her voice that needed an audience. She looked at the people nearby, inviting them into it. He carries that everywhere, every event we've ever been to, like it means something, like he's somebody's executive. She shook her head. That's Calvin for you. A few people smiled. Someone looked away. Calvin said nothing. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom doors the same way he had come in, unhurried, shoulders level, the folder under his arm. He did not look back. He pushed through the doors, crossed the marble lobby, and rode the elevator back up to level 4. He got in his truck. He sat in the parking deck with the engine off and the folder on the passenger seat beside him. The concrete was quiet. Somewhere below, valets were calling out numbers. Calvin reached into his shirt pocket and took out his phone. There was one unread email. It had arrived at 9:14 that morning, marked urgent, from a sender he recognized. Reese and Hargrove Estate Partners, Uptown Charlotte. He had not opened it yet. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set the phone face down on the seat next to the folder, and he sat in the dark of the parking deck and he breathed. But before we talk about what was in that email, before we get to what Calvin knew and when he knew it and exactly what it meant for every person still standing in that ballroom, we need to go back. Because this moment did not begin tonight. It began 8 years ago, in the early weeks of a marriage that looked from the outside like everything Adrienne Caldwell had been working toward, and it began to end almost immediately after it started. Calvin and Adrienne Reese had been, at the very beginning, something close to right. They met at a cookout in the summer, the kind where somebody's uncle is running the grill and the music is coming from a Bluetooth speaker balanced on a folding table, and the whole block smells like charcoal and seasoning. Adrienne had been laughing at something when Calvin first saw her, and the laugh was real that day. Unguarded, nothing performed about it. He was 28, she was 26. He asked for her number before he left, and she gave it to him without hesitation, which meant something then. The first 2 years were good. Calvin was steady and Adrienne was ambitious, and for a while those two things felt complementary rather than opposed. He worked his logistics position at Whitmore Development, came home on time, kept the bills current, and showed up for her the way a man is supposed to show up, quietly, consistently, without needing credit for it. She was building her real estate license, taking weekend courses, dreaming out loud about the kind of clients she was going to have. Calvin listened. He believed her. She had every reason to get there. The problem was not that Adrienne's ambitions grew. The problem was what those ambitions started measuring themselves against. Gloria Caldwell had opinions about everything, and she delivered them with the particular authority of a woman who had spent decades disguising judgment as wisdom. She came to Sunday dinner and looked around the house, a solid 3-bedroom in a good Charlotte neighborhood, nothing wrong with it, and said things like, "You all are comfortable, that's what matters," in the tone that meant the opposite. She would mention casually that her friend Denise's daughter and her husband had just bought in Ballantine. She would ask about Calvin's salary with the precision of someone taking inventory, and then nod slowly when he told her, the way a doctor nods when the test results confirm what they already suspected. Calvin heard everything Gloria said. He never responded. At work, the pattern was no different. Whitmore Development Group ran on the labor of people like Calvin. Precise, reliable, invisible. He had kept the company's logistics operation cleaner than it had ever been. Deliveries arrived on schedule. Contractor timelines held because Calvin tracked them personally. He had submitted a proposal for a senior coordinator position in his 3rd year. Brandon Whitmore had given the role to a 26-year-old who golfed with the right people and had never managed a receiving schedule in his life. Calvin was told by someone who heard it second-hand that his name had not come up in the conversation at all. He filed the rejection the same way he filed everything, without ceremony, without bitterness, without a scene. His father had been the same way. Cornelius Reese had been a quiet man who built things slowly and without announcement, and who died of a heart attack when Calvin was 19, leaving behind a house that needed a new roof and a folder of paperwork that a Charlotte law firm had mailed to Calvin's aunt's address 2 months after the funeral. The folder had arrived during the worst stretch of Calvin's grief, and he had put it in a desk drawer, meaning to look at it properly when he had the capacity, and somehow the months became years and the years became a decade, and the folder stayed where it was, locked away with the things he meant to get to when life settled down. Life had not settled down. It had simply continued, with Adrienne growing colder by degrees in a way that was hard to identify on any single day, but undeniable when you looked at a year all at once. She stopped asking about his work. She started correcting him in front of people. Small corrections. the kind designed to establish something about the person doing the correcting. She went to Whitmore Development events and came back describing Brandon's remarks on the market with the reverence of someone recounting a sermon. She mentioned more than once that Brandon had offered her a referral to one of his investors. She said it the way a woman says something she wants her husband to hear beneath the surface. Calvin heard it. He said nothing. The dinner party humiliations became a pattern. He was too cautious, too slow, too content with not enough. She said these things in the way people say true things they have repackaged as concern. Their friends stopped inviting them as a couple to certain things because the particular energy of a woman publicly managing her husband had a way of making other people uncomfortable in a room. Gloria escalated accordingly. By the 6th year of the marriage, she had stopped pretending the framing was anything other than what it was. "Calvin is a good man," she told Adrian one Sunday afternoon, loud enough for him to hear from the kitchen, "but good is not the same thing as great, and you deserve great." Calvin stood at the counter and poured himself a glass of water. He drank it slowly. 3 months before the gala, Adrienne sat across from her mother at Gloria's kitchen table and said it plainly, finely, without the softening she had been using for years. She was done waiting. She had made her decision. She had been carrying it long enough, and she was ready to put it down. Gloria reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with hers and told her she had made the right choice. Neither of them knew what was locked in the drawer of Calvin's desk, but the full picture of what Calvin endured at work, the particular brand of contempt Brandon Whitmore had perfected over years, that part of the story deserves its own telling. Brandon Whitmore ran his office the way certain men run everything, loudly, visibly, and with the constant low hum of his own self-regard filling whatever room he occupied. He had built Whitmore Development Group's public identity from the ground up, or so the story went. His name was on the letterhead, his face on the billboard on Independence Boulevard, his handshake closing deals in conference rooms where the catering was ordered in advance and the chairs were arranged specifically to signal who was important. He was a man who understood the theatre of power completely, which was why he was so good at it, and why he had never once considered that the stage he performed on might belong to someone else. Calvin had worked underneath Brandon for 6 years. In that time, Brandon had learned his name, occasionally used it correctly, and otherwise treated him with the specific indifference reserved for infrastructure. The kind of thing you depend on entirely and never think about until it stops working. Calvin was not invited to strategy meetings. He was not copied on communications above a certain tier. When contractors asked to escalate coordination issues to senior leadership, Brandon's assistant rerouted the calls back to Calvin with a note that said, in various polished phrasings, that this was not a conversation for the executive floor. The remark that defined it happened on a Tuesday, 18 months before the gala. Brandon had been in the quarterly leadership meeting, a closed session on the 22nd floor that Calvin had never attended and was never expected to attend. Someone on the executive team had apparently raised Calvin's name in the context of a potential operations restructuring, suggesting his institutional knowledge might be worth consulting. Brandon had dismissed it in a single sentence. Calvin learned the exact wording 3 days later from a woman in accounting who felt bad enough about it to say something quietly over coffee in the break room. Brandon had said, "Calvin is a logistics conversation, not a strategy conversation." Calvin thanked her for telling him. He finished his coffee. He went back to his desk and processed 14 contractor invoices before noon, all of them accurate, all of them on time. What he did not know yet, what he had no framework to suspect, was that Adrienne had started appearing at Whitmore development events around that same period, not as Calvin's wife, as Brandon's guest. Brandon had told his staff she was a real estate referral partner, which was technically true and comprehensively misleading. She attended a rooftop reception in September, a client dinner in October, a weekend development conference in Raleigh in November that she told Calvin was a continuing education requirement for her license. Calvin noticed things. He was a logistics man. Noticing things was the entire job. He noticed that Adrienne's calendar had entries he was not familiar with. He noticed new clothing appearing in the closet without the usual commentary about where it came from. He noticed that she came home from the Raleigh conference on a Sunday evening, smelling like a hotel bar and a different kind of confidence than she left with. He filed these observations the way he filed everything, without ceremony, without accusation, in a quiet internal ledger that he kept closed and did not discuss. He talked to Darius instead. Darius Reese was 61 years old, retired from the Postal Service after 32 years, and constitutionally incapable of pretending things were fine when they were not. He lived 20 minutes from Calvin in a house he had owned outright since his 40s, with a vegetable garden in the backyard and an opinion about everything. He was the only person in Calvin's life who spoke to him the way a man speaks to someone he actually respects, directly, without softening, without an agenda behind it. They were sitting on Darius's back porch on a Saturday in January, 2 months before the gala, when Darius put down his glass and looked at Calvin with the particular attention of a man who has been watching something develop for longer than he has said. "You need to check that paperwork your daddy left," Darius said. Calvin looked at him. "I mean it," Darius said. "Whatever's in that folder, you've been meaning to look at it for years. Look at it." Calvin drove home that evening and went directly to his desk. The drawer was locked. He kept it that way, not because he thought anyone would go through it, but because some things deserved to be kept with intention. He unlocked it. He took the folder out and set it on the desk under the lamp. The paperwork was older than he remembered. Some of the pages had yellowed at the edges, but the letterhead on the top document was clean and specific. Reese and Hargrove Estate Partners, with an uptown Charlotte address and a phone number. Calvin called the number the following Monday morning. The woman who answered was professional and unhurried. She took his name, put him on hold for 90 seconds, and came back with a tone that had shifted, more careful, more deliberate. She told him the estate had been in extended probate review and that the senior partner had been expecting his call. She said they could schedule a meeting at his earliest availability. He asked what the earliest opening was. She told him, Thursday morning, the week after next. He wrote the date down. He did not yet know that Adrienne had already chosen that same Thursday evening to make her announcement at the gala. He did not know what the folder contained or what the name Reese and Hargrove was about to mean to every person who had ever treated him like he was invisible. He only knew that for the first time in a very long time he felt something adjacent to anticipation. That Thursday morning came fast, and what happened inside the offices of Reese and Hargrove Estate Partners changed everything. Changed the nature of every slight, every dismissal, every dinner party comment, every sentence Brandon Whitmore had ever said about him in a room he was not allowed to enter. The offices of Reese and Hargrove Estate Partners occupied the 14th floor of a building on Tryon Street, uptown Charlotte, where the carpet was thick and the receptionist spoke in the measured tones of someone who had been trained to make people feel that whatever they were about to hear would be handled with complete discretion. Calvin arrived 7 minutes early. He wore the same charcoal suit he would wear to the gala that evening, because he only owned one, and he had not known, when he scheduled this appointment, that both events would fall on the same day. He sat in the waiting area with the manila folder across his knees and watched the morning light come through the floor-to-ceiling windows and said nothing to anyone. Darius was in the chair beside him, big hands folded in his lap, reading nothing, doing nothing, simply present in the way that only certain people know how to be. At 9 on the clock a door opened and Evelyn Hargrove appeared. She was 54 years old, compact, natural grey at her temples, and she wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse in the manner of a woman who had long ago stopped dressing to impress anyone and started dressing to function at maximum efficiency. She looked at Calvin with the particular attention of someone who had been expecting this meeting for a very long time. "Calvin Reese," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. She shook his hand, nodded once at Darius, and led Calvin into a conference room where 2 manila folders sat on the table, hers thick with documentation, and the space on the opposite side of the table where his would rest. She did not begin with small talk. Evelyn Hargrove explained that she had managed the Reese family estate for 19 years. She said she had known his father, not well, but well enough to know that Cornelius Reese had been a man who built things quietly and without announcement, and who had trusted that the right moment for disclosure would eventually arrive. She said the estate had been in extended probate review due to the complexity of the assets involved, and that the review had concluded in full the previous week. She said everything that followed would be straightforward. Then she told him what his father had left behind. Cornelius Reese had been, in 1987, a co-founder, not a public one, the kind whose name appeared on internal incorporation documents and nowhere else, a deliberate choice made with the other founding party to allow the operating face of the business to build its public identity unencumbered, while the structural ownership remained protected and private. The company they had co-founded was a holding entity. That holding entity had grown through a series of legal acquisitions and subsidiary formations into the parent structure of what eventually became Whitmore Development Group. Calvin's father held 51%. He had never sold it, never transferred it, never disclosed it to the operating partner's side. The arrangement, per the original agreement, required no such disclosure. Silent majority shareholder positions were not uncommon in complex holding structures, Evelyn explained, and the operating partners of subsidiary companies were under no legal obligation to be informed of who held controlling interest at the parent level, provided that shareholder remained silent. Cornelius Reese had remained silent for 37 years. Calvin sat very still. Evelyn continued, the current portfolio, commercial and residential assets across 7 states, including every property developed under the Whitmore Development Group name, carried a combined valuation of $2.2 trillion. The liquid holdings alone were significant. There were quarterly income streams, royalty structures on 3 commercial developments, and a trust account that had been accumulating distributions for 11 years, waiting for the rightful heir to come and claim them. Calvin heard all of this. Then he asked his one question. Does Brandon Whitmore know who holds the majority position? Evelyn looked at him steadily. No, she said. Operating partners at the subsidiary level are not privy to the parent company's shareholder structure. Brandon Whitmore has operated under the assumption that the holding entity is managed by a passive institutional investor. He has never requested disclosure, and no disclosure has ever been made. Calvin nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. He understood it completely, immediately, and without requiring it to be explained further. Every meeting he had been excluded from, every promotion redirected to someone else, every sentence Brandon had ever said about him in a room he was not allowed to enter. All of it had been delivered by a man who was, structurally, without knowing it, operating at Calvin's discretion. Brandon Whitmore had never owned his own company. He had been running it for the man he treated like furniture. Evelyn slid the transfer documents across the table. Calvin read each page with the same methodical attention he gave contractor invoices. Fully, without rushing, without skipping. When he reached the signature line, he picked up the pen she had placed beside the papers and signed his name in the unhurried, even hand of a man who understood the weight of what he was doing. The time on the conference room clock read 9:14. Evelyn countersigned. She dated the document. She placed her firm's seal at the bottom and said simply, "It's done. Congratulations, Mr. Rees." He sat in silence for 1 full minute. Then he stood, picked up the folder, thanked her for her time, and walked back through the door into the waiting area where Darius was still sitting with his hands folded, watching the door like he had not moved a single muscle since Calvin went in. Calvin stopped in front of him. "We're good," Calvin said. Darius looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who understood that those 2 words contained everything that needed to be said. They rode the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, Calvin checked his watch. It was 9:37 in the morning. The gala started at 7 in the evening. He had the rest of the day, and he had a decision to make about how to spend it. He decided to go home. He pressed his suit. He ate a quiet lunch alone at the kitchen table. And at 6:45 that evening, he picked up the manila folder. The same folder, the one that had lived in his desk drawer for years, the one that now contained the controlling interest certificate bearing his name, tucked it under his arm, and drove his 10-year-old pickup to the Charlotte Convention Center. He already knew in some quiet part of himself that the night would not be ordinary. He did not know yet exactly how right he was. But by the time he walked back out of that ballroom with the folder still under his arm and Adrienne's voice still ringing in the air behind him, he would know precisely what he was going to do with everything he now held. Calvin did not go back to the house that night. He drove from the parking deck to Darius's place, 20 minutes south, and arrived just before 10 with the folder under his arm and nothing else. Darius opened the door, looked at him, stepped aside without a word, and went to the kitchen to heat up whatever was left from dinner. Calvin sat at the table and ate pot roast and rice in silence while the gospel station played low from the counter radio, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said yet. He slept in the guest room on a bed with a quilt his aunt had made, and he slept without difficulty. Friday morning arrived grey and quiet. Calvin sat on Darius's back porch with a cup of coffee and his phone and called Evelyn Hargrove at 8:45. She answered on the second ring. He told her he was ready to move. He told her he wanted a shareholder action filed at market open on Monday morning. No warnings, no advance notice to the board, no communication of any kind to Brandon Whitmore or anyone connected to him before the filing was complete and recorded. Evelyn said she understood. She said her team had been prepared for this possibility since the probate review concluded, and that the documentation was ready to execute on his instruction. Then she walked him through what Monday morning would look like in the precise, unadorned language she used for everything. The shareholder action would trigger an immediate administrative freeze on Brandon Whitmore's operating authority at the subsidiary level. His company credentials would be suspended. His access to corporate accounts would be locked pending shareholder review. And because the freeze would constitute a material change in the company's control structure, it would automatically initiate a mandatory financial audit of all accounts connected to the parent holding entity, including every project account, every subsidiary transaction log, and every external financial relationship recorded under the company's tax identification number. Calvin listened. Then he asked about the audit specifically. He asked what the audit would surface if there were irregular transactions running through the project accounts, personal funds being cycled through company structures in ways that did not reflect legitimate business activity. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said that any such transactions would be identified, flagged, and referred to the appropriate authorities. She said that the audit process was thorough, legally mandated, and entirely outside her firm's control once initiated. She said it the way a person says something true without editorializing. Calvin said he understood. He asked one more thing. He asked about 6 specific luxury property listings currently active under Adrienne Rees's real estate license, Whitmore Development Properties, that Adrienne was contractually owed commission on upon sale. He wanted to know what happened to those listings when the company entered mandatory restructuring. Evelyn confirmed that all active listings tied to Whitmore Development assets would be pulled from market during the restructuring period. Commission agreements tied to those listings would be voided by the restructuring clause in the company's standard agent contracts. Adrienne's pipeline would be empty within 48 hours of the filing. Calvin said nothing for a moment. Then he said he also wanted to authorize the press release. Evelyn had prepared a draft announcing Calvin Rees as the new majority shareholder and incoming chairman of Whitmore Development Group. Calvin asked her to hold it until Friday of the following week. He wanted it timed precisely, distributed to Charlotte Business Press, regional outlets, and the company's own communications channels simultaneously at 10 in the morning, when the business day was fully open and the most people would see it at once. Evelyn said she would have it ready. Calvin thanked her, ended the call, and set his phone on the porch railing. He looked at Darius's vegetable garden for a while, the collards coming in along the back fence, the tomato cages standing straight in the morning air. He thought about his father. He thought about the kind of man who builds something real and says nothing about it, and trusts that the right person will find it when the time comes. He picked up his phone again and called a locksmith to change the locks on nothing. He had already decided he did not want the house. He would find somewhere clean and his own. He spent the weekend doing ordinary things. He helped Darius replace a section of fence on Saturday afternoon. He went to his mother's church on Sunday morning, sat in the 3rd pew from the back, and listened to the choir run through a song he had known since he was 9 years old. He did not tell anyone what was coming. He ate breakfast. He read. He slept. Monday morning, Calvin Rees put on his work clothes, drove his pickup to Whitmore Development Group, badged through the employee entrance, and sat down at his logistics desk at 8:15 in the morning. He processed his Monday morning delivery confirmations. He reviewed 3 contractor invoices. He responded to 4 emails, all of them mundane, all of them accurate. At 8:58 he saw Brandon Whitmore come through the lobby doors below. Silver at the temples, suit fitted perfectly, the particular stride of a man who had never once walked into that building thinking it could be taken from him. Calvin watched him cross the lobby and step into the elevator. He turned back to his screen. At 9 o'clock exactly, Evelyn Hargrove's firm filed the shareholder action with the State Business Registry. Somewhere on the 22nd floor, a letter was sitting on Brandon Whitmore's desk, and a key card was about to stop working, and a man who had spent years looking through Calvin Rees was about to discover for the first time that he had no idea what he had been looking at. Brandon Whitmore arrived at the office at 8:52 on Monday morning, which was his custom. He liked being in before 9. It established something, a tone, a hierarchy of effort, the unspoken message that the building ran on his rhythm. He nodded at the lobby attendant, rode the elevator to 22, and walked toward his office door with the particular confidence of a man who had never once arrived at work uncertain of his welcome. His key card didn't work. He swiped it again. The panel blinked red. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has made an obvious error, stepped back and tried once more. Read again. On his desk, visible through the glass panel beside the door, was a white envelope with the Reese and Hargrove estate partners letterhead showing through the paper. He had his assistant let him in. He picked up the envelope, opened it standing at his desk, and read it with the irritated speed of someone who expected to find a mistake they could correct in under 5 minutes. He did not find a mistake. He called his attorney, Gerald Osei, before he had finished reading. Gerald was at Brandon's office by 10:30. He took the documents, read them carefully, asked for a glass of water, and read them again. Brandon stood at the window while Gerald read, looking out at the Charlotte skyline, the buildings, the cranes, the particular geometry of a city being continuously built. He had always loved that view. Gerald set the documents down. He told Brandon the filing was legitimate. He told him the majority shareholder position had been held by a private party since the company's founding, not an institution, not a fund, a named individual whose identity was protected under the terms of the original silent shareholder agreement. He told Brandon the shareholder had now activated their controlling interest and filed the corresponding action with the state registry. He told Brandon this was not a clerical error. Brandon asked who the shareholder was. Gerald told him disclosure was not yet required under the current filing stage. Brandon asked what that meant in practical terms. Gerald told him his operating authority was suspended pending shareholder review. His company accounts were locked. Any active contracts under his personal signature were now subject to restructuring protocols. Brandon went very still. He asked about the 3 development projects currently mid-close. Gerald pulled up the project files on his laptop. He looked at the penalty clauses. He told Brandon that each clause had been personally signed, that each one was now triggered by the account freeze, and that the combined exposure across all 3 projects was $340 million. Brandon sat down. He sat in the chair he had occupied for every executive meeting in that building, the one at the head of the table, and for the first time since he had taken that seat, he looked like he did not belong in it. He called Adrienne at noon. He kept his voice even. He used the tone he used for manageable setbacks, calm, explanatory, already headed toward resolution. He told her there was a paperwork issue at the company, a shareholder filing that his attorney was handling, and that it would be resolved by Friday. He told her not to worry. He used the word routine. Adrienne asked if it was serious. He said no. She believed him, or she chose to, which was the same thing. She called Gloria after she hung up because she called Gloria after everything and relayed what Brandon had told her in the tone of a woman passing along mildly interesting news. Gloria listened. She said in the way she said it when she was not saying what she was thinking. After she hung up with Adrienne, she made a different call. To a woman she knew who did bookkeeping work adjacent to several uptown firms, a contact cultivated over years for exactly the kind of quiet inquiry that Gloria preferred to make without leaving a trail. The contact called back in 2 hours. What Gloria learned was this: the filing had triggered a mandatory financial audit, not a routine review, a full audit covering every account connected to the parent holding entity, every transaction log, every external financial relationship recorded under the company's identification number. Gloria put her phone down on her kitchen counter and looked at it for a long moment. She had been cycling her own personal funds through Adrienne's real estate transactions for 11 months, using Brandon's project accounts as a conduit, running money through commission structures in amounts that stayed just below the reporting thresholds. It was not a complicated scheme, but it did not need to be complicated to be federal. She did not call Adrienne back. She called her own attorney instead. By Wednesday, Brandon had made 4 more calls to Gerald, each one more desperate than the last. Each time, Gerald told him the same thing. The shareholder's identity would be disclosed at the appropriate stage of the process, and there was nothing to do but wait. Brandon had no operating authority. He had no account access. He had $340 million in personal exposure and no name to argue with. He drove to the office that Wednesday evening and sat in the parking deck, the same deck, level 4. He did not know this was the same level where Calvin Reese had sat 4 days earlier in a 10-year-old pickup with a manila folder on the passenger seat, reading an email that changed everything. Brandon sat in his car with his phone in his hand and nothing useful to do with it. The name was coming on Friday. He did not know that yet. But something in the silence of that parking deck told him without words that what was coming was not a paperwork issue. The press release went out at 10 o'clock Friday morning. Charlotte Business Journal, The Observer, 3 regional wire services, the Whitmore Development Group internal communications channel, all at once, all simultaneous, all carrying the same headline. Calvin Reese, named majority shareholder and incoming chairman of Whitmore Development Group. The name dropped like a stone into still water. Brandon saw it on his phone at 10:14. He was at Gerald's office, waiting on another call that was not coming, and he read the name and read it again and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he stood up. Gerald told him to sit down. Brandon did not sit down. The first domino fell before noon. $340 million in personal penalty clauses Brandon had signed with his own hand on projects he had approved with authority he did not actually possess, were formally called by the creditors who held them. His personal accounts were flagged. By 2 in the afternoon, asset freeze orders had been filed against his investment portfolio, his personal real estate holdings, and the 2 vehicles registered in his name. Brandon Whitmore, the man whose name was on the building, was worth less than nothing before the business day ended. The second domino hit Adrienne at 10:22. Her broker called before she saw the press release. 6 listings pulled. All Whitmore Development properties, commission agreements voided under restructuring clause. Her broker used the word, unfortunately, 4 times in 90 seconds. Adrienne's pipeline, 6 luxury listings totaling just over $11 million in projected commission, was gone. 0. The calls she had been expecting to close in the next 60 days would not be closing. The clients would be reassigned. There was nothing to discuss. She hung up and looked at her phone. The third domino was already rolling. Her colleagues were sharing the press release across every group thread she was in. Someone had screenshotted the Charlotte Business Journal headline and posted it with 3 question mark emojis. Someone else had found Calvin's staff photo from the Whitmore Development Company page. The same photo that had lived on the employee directory for 6 years, quietly, unremarkably, and placed it next to his new chairman headshot. The contrast was not subtle. The comments were not kind to Adrienne. The social narrative she had spent 8 years constructing, the image of a woman who had made clear-eyed choices and married up, inverted, overnight, publicly, in front of every person whose opinion she had spent 8 years managing. By Saturday morning, she had stopped looking at her phone. But the phone kept ringing. Gloria called on Thursday night of the following week, not Sunday, not at a reasonable hour. Late after 10, which was how Adrienne knew, before she answered, that something had broken loose. Gloria's voice was not the voice Adrienne had known her entire life. It was stripped of everything: the church cadence, the composed authority, the practiced warmth that Gloria deployed like a tool. What was left underneath was raw and small and frightened. She told Adrienne that federal investigators had made contact, that the mandatory financial audit had surfaced transactions Gloria had run through Adrienne's real estate commission structures over the past 11 months. That her attorney had told her the exposure was serious, that the catering business was being dissolved immediately as a precaution, that Adrienne should call her own attorney in the morning and say nothing to anyone in the meantime. Adrienne called Brandon the moment she hung up. He did not answer. She called again. Still nothing. A third time. Voicemail. She drove to the house that had been hers, that Brandon had moved into, that she had walked away from Calvin's life to secure. She pulled up to find Brandon's car in the driveway and 2 suitcases on the front step. He came out as she pulled up, carrying a third bag, and the look on his face when he saw her was not the look of a man who intended to have a conversation. He told her he was going to stay with his brother in Atlanta while things got sorted. She asked him what things. He put the bag in the car and drove away. Adrienne stood in the driveway and looked at the front door of the house she had chosen over her marriage and her dignity. She went inside and sat on the couch in the living room that still had Brandon's taste in everything, the furniture, the art, the throw pillows she had never picked, and she opened her phone one more time. The press release photo was still on her screen. Calvin, seated at the head of a conference table in the Whitmore Development boardroom, suit fitted properly for the first time because someone had taken it to a tailor the morning after the gala. Expression calm, shoulders settled. And there, visible on the table in front of him, slightly open, unmistakable, the manila folder, the hall pass. She stared at it for a long time. Calvin Reese was not staring at anything. He was at Darius's house in the same chair he always sat in, eating leftover pot roast out of a container while the game played on the television and Darius argued with the referee from the couch. He had not checked the news. He had not monitored any of it. He had done what he set in motion, and then he had stepped back, the way a man steps back from a door he has already opened, and let the wind do the rest. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept without difficulty. The following week a request arrived through Evelyn Hargrove's office. Adrienne Reese was asking for a meeting. Her attorney had filed the formal inquiry on her behalf, jointly with Brandon's counsel. They wanted to understand the full scope of the shareholder situation. They wanted to discuss options. Calvin read the request. He thought for a moment. Then he called Evelyn and told her to confirm one meeting. The boardroom, the 22nd floor, Monday morning, his terms, his schedule, his table. Calvin arrived at the 22nd floor at 8:45 in the morning. He rode the elevator alone. He walked down the corridor he had walked 100 times, past the reception desk, past the glass-walled offices, past the framed project renders of buildings in 7 states that he had coordinated the logistics for without ever being invited to the meetings where they were planned. He walked to the boardroom at the end of the hall, and he opened the door, and he went inside. He sat at the head of the table. He had never sat there before. The chair was no different from the others. Same leather, same height, same casters on the base. But the view from it was different. From this seat you could see the full length of the table, all 16 chairs, the Charlotte skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind where the other parties would sit. Calvin set the manila folder on the table in front of him and folded his hands and waited. Brandon arrived first, with Gerald beside him. Calvin had seen Brandon diminished before, in photographs in the parking deck across the lobby. But in person, in this room, the deterioration was specific and complete. The suit was right, but the man inside it was wrong. The silver at the temples looked different when the confidence beneath it was gone. Brandon sat across the table and to the left, as far from the head as protocol allowed. and he did not make eye contact. Adrienne came in 2 minutes later with her attorney, a woman named Patricia, who kept her hand briefly at Adrienne's elbow as they entered. Adrienne was composed in the way a person is composed when composure is the only thing they have left to protect. She sat across from Brandon's position, diagonal to Calvin, and she looked at the folder on the table in front of him, and then she looked at him, and something moved behind her eyes that was not quite recognition and not quite grief. Calvin let the room settle. Then he opened the folder. He did not make theatre of it. He simply placed the controlling interest certificate on the table between them, flat, visible to everyone, and he looked at Brandon first. He told Brandon the history plainly, his father's name, the year of the co-founding, the terms of the silent shareholder agreement and why those terms had been structured the way they were. He explained that the holding entity had held 51% of majority control since the company's founding, and that this position had transferred to Calvin upon the completion of probate at 9:14 in the morning on the day of Adrienne's firm's awards gala. He explained that this transfer had been managed by Rees and Hargrove estate partners for 19 years, that it had been entirely legal and entirely invisible, and that Brandon had operated Whitmore Development Group as an operating partner, never as its owner, for the entirety of his career. Brandon's jaw worked. He said he wanted to discuss a settlement. He said there were options. He said he had built this company's public identity from nothing, and that had to count for something, that there had to be a conversation about compensation, about transition, about what was fair. Calvin looked at him. "There is nothing to negotiate," he said. "You were the operating partner. That was the full scope of your authority. The paperwork reflects that. The courts have reviewed it. This conversation is not that conversation." Brandon stopped talking. Calvin turned to Adrienne. He took his time. He let the silence in the room exist for a moment without filling it, because the silence deserved to be there. It had been waiting 8 years to occupy that space. He told her he was not angry. He said it without softness and without coldness, just as a fact, because it was true. What he felt was not anger. Anger required surprise, and Calvin Rees had not been surprised by Adrienne in a very long time. He reminded her of the gala. Not the announcement. She did not need reminding of that. But the folder, the specific moment when she had held it up to the crowd, when she had made it the punchline, when she had used it to draw the final public line between who she was choosing to be and who she was choosing to leave behind. He reminded her that she had called it his hall pass for years, that she had said it like it was the most embarrassing thing about him, that she had said it like it meant nothing. He reached over and placed his hand on the certificate. "You spent 8 years embarrassed to be seen with me," he said. "Brandon spent 8 years looking through me at my own desk, but what neither of you knew was that every paycheck he ever signed, every building with his name on it, every promise he ever made you, all of it ran through a company that became mine at 9:14 in the morning on the same day you handed me those divorce papers." He paused. "You didn't leave me for your boss, Adrienne. You left me for my employee." The room was completely still. Adrienne's composure did not shatter all at once. It went quietly, the way a structure goes when the load-bearing element is finally removed. First a tremor in the jaw, then the eyes, then a single sound that was not quite a word, not quite a cry, something caught in the space between them. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Calvin did not move toward her. He did not move away. He simply sat with what he had said, letting it exist in the room the way truth exists, without needing anything from anyone. Brandon made one more attempt. He said Calvin's name, started a sentence about what they could build together going forward, some pivot toward partnership. Calvin stood up. "We're done here," he said. He looked at both attorneys. "Thank you for your time." He picked up the folder. He closed it. He walked to the boardroom door, down the corridor, and to the elevator. He pressed the button. The doors opened. He stepped in. As the doors closed, he caught his own reflection in the polished metal panel. Unhurried, settled, finished. The folder under his arm, the same folder, the hall pass. It had always meant something. They just hadn't known what. 6 months is a long time in a city that moves as fast as Charlotte. 6 months is long enough for a name to be removed from a building, long enough for a bankruptcy filing to work its way through the courts and come out the other side with nothing attached to it but debt and a forwarding address in another state. Long enough for the people who once built their identities around a man's reflected success to discover, one by one, that the reflection was all there ever was. Brandon Whitmore's personal bankruptcy was finalized on a Wednesday morning in early spring. The name came off the building the following week, a crew with scaffolding and a removal permit working through a Tuesday afternoon while the city went about its business below. The Whitmore Development Group was renamed under Calvin's restructuring directive. The press covered it briefly, professionally, without drama. Brandon himself was not available for comment because Brandon was no longer in Charlotte. He had gone to Atlanta, then to his brother's place, then somewhere else that nobody in the company's new leadership structure needed to track. He had left behind $340 million in personal liability and a company that had never legally belonged to him. Gloria Caldwell's catering business was dissolved the same week the federal referral was filed. Her church community, the one she had cultivated for 30 years, the one she had used as a social platform with the same precision she used everything else, absorbed the news in the way church communities absorb scandal, with a period of collective silence followed by a quiet, permanent rearrangement of who sat where and who called whom. The federal investigation was ongoing. Her attorney had advised her to limit her public appearances. Gloria, who had spent 6 decades performing wisdom in every room she entered, had nothing left to perform. Adrienne's real estate license was under formal review by the state licensing board, a process that moved slowly and without mercy. The apartment lease she had signed with Brandon as co-signer had been broken when his credit collapsed, and she had moved into a cousin's spare room in Gastonia, a fact that traveled through the Charlotte real estate community in the particular way that humiliating information travels quietly and completely. The divorce was finalized without a settlement. She had signed a prenuptial agreement 8 years earlier that Calvin had never mentioned and never leveraged until his attorney did, cleanly and without excess. She received what she came into the marriage with, nothing more. Calvin restructured Whitmore Development Group over 3 months with the same methodical attention he had brought to every logistics problem in his career. He retained Evelyn Hargrove as general counsel, a decision that surprised no one who had watched how the restructuring unfolded, and that Evelyn accepted without ceremony in the way she accepted everything. The company's new leadership team was assembled on merit. The culture changed because the culture always follows whoever is actually in charge, and for the first time in the company's history, the person in charge was the person who had always held the controlling position. The Reese Foundation opened its doors on the first Saturday of April. It occupied a converted warehouse on the west side of Charlotte that Calvin had purchased and renovated over 8 weeks. A building that had been a logistics hub 40 years ago and was now a training center, its floors refinished, its walls repainted, its loading dock converted into a community entrance with a covered overhang and a sign that read simply, Reese Foundation. Workforce development and logistics training. The first cohort was 40 young men from the surrounding neighborhoods, enrolled in a 12-week program covering supply chain coordination, fleet management, and operation systems. The precise skills Calvin had spent 8 years applying invisibly. Darius was at the ribbon cutting. He stood near the back of the small crowd that had gathered for the ceremony, wearing his good jacket, the one he saved for occasions that deserved it, and when Calvin spoke briefly at the podium, he looked in Darius's direction once, toward the end, and said that the foundation would not exist without the people who told him the truth, when it was easier to say nothing. It was the kind of thanks that men like them give each other, compressed, exact, requiring no elaboration. Darius nodded once, the same nod from the waiting room at Rees and Hargrove, and that was the whole of it. Naomi Osei was at the event professionally. She was a civil engineer contracted to review the foundation's planned expansion site, a second building 2 blocks east that Calvin intended to open the following year. She had her site plans under her arm and her hard hat clipped to her bag when she introduced herself after the ceremony, directly, without performance. She asked what the foundation was really for, not the stated mission, but the actual reason behind it. She asked it the way a person asks when they genuinely want to know. Calvin told her. He said his father had built something quietly and without announcement for 37 years and never saw it used. He said he intended to use what he had been given in a way his father would recognize. He said he thought the most honest thing a person with resources could do was put those resources where the need was real and the people were ready. Naomi listened to the whole answer. She did not fill the silence at the end of it with anything unnecessary. They exchanged numbers before she left, professionally, without drama, the way things begin when they are going to last. Calvin drove home that evening in his pickup. It was 10 years old, and the right rear speaker had never worked properly, and there was a dent in the passenger door from a parking lot incident in 2019 that he had never gotten around to fixing. He could have replaced it the morning after the signing at Rees and Hargrove. He could replace it now with something that cost more than most people made in a year. He drove it home anyway, because the truck worked, because it had always worked, because the measure of a thing was never what it looked like from the outside. That is the truth this story leaves behind. Not that patience is rewarded, though it is. Not that arrogance is punished, though it is. The truth is simpler and older than either of those. Some people carry everything they are in plain sight in a folder under their arm, in a quiet they never felt the need to explain. And the people who mistake that quiet for emptiness, who laugh at the folder, who dismiss the man, who mistake reliability for limitation, those people have already made the only mistake that matters. They assumed they knew what they were looking at. They did not. Now, before you go, what would you have done in Calvin's position? Would you have waited as long as he did? Would you have said something at the gala? Or would you have walked out exactly the way he did and let the folder do the talking? Drop your answer in the comments. This community always has something worth saying, and I want to hear it. If this story moved you even a little, hit that like button one more time on your way out. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need to hear these stories. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because what we have coming next is going to be something you do not want to miss. I will see you in the next one.